Hello, everybody. Welcome uh, to one more of the WindowsWear Live. Today we have a very special guest. Is an associate director and assistant professor at Parsons and the co-founder of Fashion Concert, which he will be speaking more about. And he's one of the earliest supporters of WindowsWear, and we appreciate very much the relationship that we have with him. So please, everybody, welcome Joshua Williams. He'll be giving us a conversation about building brands values virtually. So please welcome Josh.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you on this live stream today. And I don't know about you all, but I find that I've been busier than ever on more Zoom calls than ever and more meetings than ever. And so I do appreciate all of you who have taken the time to be with us here at WindowsWear today. And thank you to the WindowsWear team. I have been a part of what they've been doing for so many years, and just it's great to see how it's grown and the resource that it's become in the fashion industry. So my goal today is, I was talking to everyone at WindowsWear, we wanted to maybe do something a little bit different than maybe what you've been hearing. And one of the things that I've been hearing from industry experts is the fact that fashion brands especially are having to kind of rethink or reset how they're going to do business post-COVID-19. And I wanted to focus on something more positive rather than negative, because I think it's so easy to get overwhelmed by all of the issues that we're facing, whether it's just a real lack of sales and just the inability to engage with our customers in brick and mortar. So I thought maybe just coming from a different perspective today, perhaps from a little bit more of an academic perspective, I could share some ideas with all of you, no matter if you're in leadership roles or if you're an employee or if you're a student, just thinking about perhaps how we can think about the fashion industry and just work in general differently. And so today, as Raul said, we're going to look at how do brands build value and how do they do that virtually. And I'm going to start kind of with a framework and sort of set that up for you and give you some background on how I see brands providing value, but from an internal perspective. And I'll give you some examples and some ideas of how to do that virtually in the bigger sort of overview that I'm going to provide. So I want to start first with just this idea of education and this pursuit of education. I don't know about you all, but when I think of education, typically I think of, whether it's high school or going to college or getting your master's degree. And I very rarely think about it in terms of my day-to-day. Yes, I love to read books. I'm a professor by trade, so I spend a lot of time doing, my own research and thinking about how to prepare for classes. But I find that quite often I don't really feel like I'm in an education mode. And I think that's one of the key areas that I want to talk about today. What really is education, and how can we think about that in terms of brand values beyond just going to college, taking a class, reading a book, and so on. Really at the core of education is sort of ongoing personal development and learning things, or sort of expanding our knowledge base so that we have the tools that we need to make better decisions, to know how to interact. And obviously in this kind of time of crisis, this has come to the forefront. In addition, I think that education, from my perspective as a professor, is not just about what you learn, or it's about how you learn and who you learn with. For me, I got my master's degree. This is going back many years ago, and I learned a lot in that. But it's really the relationships that I created, the connections and the network all over the globe, that has really served me well as I've gone out into the fashion industry, worked first as a professional and then in the industry, and then as a teacher. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about, and I will give you some examples a little bit later on about what that means potentially for education. But just in terms of a framework, typically the way we think of education is we go to elementary school and then middle school and high school, and then we go to college, and then we go get a job. And then if we get a little stuck in our career, or maybe we want to sort of get to the next level, we might come back and go to graduate school. And then obviously in some industries to get a doctorate. And I think it's really important to kind of point out here that this idea of even getting a bachelor's education, let alone a master's education in fashion, is a relatively new idea. Um, Most of the initial programs around fashion really didn't start becoming bachelor's programs until the mid 90s, and that's when colleges realized that fashion was sort of going beyond its sort of family roots, right, as family-owned businesses, and really becoming more corporatized, and that there was a lot of opportunity to think about fashion, especially in lifestyle industries, from the framework of an academic experience that really looked at business, looked at philosophy, looked at all sorts of different areas, and tried to essentially buoy up what would be a fashion education. Nowadays, it's not unusual to see a master's degree in fashion management, for example, which I'm a part of at Parsons School of Design here in New York City, or like the Global Fashion Management program at FIT. But what's really interesting about this is that typically once we graduate from college, our goal is typically to stop learning, right? And is to start working and make money. And we have to get to work because we have to sort of pay back all those school loans and student loans that we have. And it's not to say that once we get that first job, we don't learn on the job. In fact, I think that's a very key part of any person's success, is the ability to go from college into their first job and really be open to learning whatever they can, especially in the fashion industry where there are such specific skills at play. But typically, once we've gotten into our jobs and we've gotten into our careers, we start to develop expertise, and we start to develop a sense of what works and what doesn't work. So if you're a merchandiser, you start to understand for whatever brand you're working with, the consumer and how they react when you provide certain styles on the floor, and whether it's narrow, deep, or broad, or what colors, or whatever the trends are. You start to have a really good handle on that, and we start at a certain point to start to coast, and not coast in a bad or a lazy way, but we have best practices, we have benchmarks, and our goal is simply to ensure that those benchmarks are met on a regular basis, and if and also to grow that, right, and to sort of make it better or to scale it. But we kind of stop learning sort of in the big picture way. We stop potentially reading books on philosophy or economic models because we don't have time. And sometimes it's hard to see how that relates back to our business. So we tend to start to stick to things that work for us, and we just sort of rinse and repeat. And we hope that these things can continue to scale as we go. And sometimes we even become experts in our own fields, and we become leaders in those areas. But we've stopped taking the time to really learn beyond simply what we know. And we start to settle to a certain degree. There was a really wonderful article that came out in the Atlantic, David Brooks, and it just kind of stopped me in my tracks. And this was a quote that comes from this. He discusses this idea or theory of maximum taste, and he suggests that we're all intrinsically know that we are more interesting in our 20s than we are in our 30s, and suggests that it's because in our 20s we're really engaged in all sorts of activities, even ones that sort of make us uncomfortable, right? Because we're just trying to get our feet underneath us. But by the time we hit our 30s, especially as we get into our 40s, we start to be less fun. And maybe that's because we start to settle down, whatever that means. We move to the suburbs, we settle into our jobs. There's a lot of different things that certainly happen. But he suggests that we're sort of losing out, right? We're losing out on the potential to think bigger, to really hit sort of our maximum potential if we're not going beyond what it is we do every day. He recounts an example where he was teaching at the same time some university students along with some executives. And I'll quote this because I think it's just perfectly said. He said, "I assigned the same essay to both groups, an essay on Tolstoy by the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And the college students found it so easy to read. And it's not that hard of an essay to grasp, he says. The 30 and 40 somethings, however, really struggled. Their reading comprehension had declined in the decades since college, and so was their ability to play with ideas. Their upper limit of their mind was lower than it used to be. And like I said, this sort of stopped me in my tracks because even as a teacher, I don't know about you, this really resonates with me, especially right now when we are pushing so quickly to move everything online for our students, and there's so many different meetings. I also, at the beginning of the pandemic, thought to myself, great, I'm going to have some time to read. And I even bought some books on Audible, and I just had a whole sort of plan. I joined a MOOC and had plans to sort of learn something for the first time in a long time. And alas, I have not yet completed that book. And I've gotten so busy. And it was just a reminder again of how, even as an educator, it's really hard to educate myself. So while we put a lot of focus on learning while we're younger, we tend not to put that same focus uh, as we get older and as we get into our careers. But with the maximum theory taste in mind, wouldn't we stand to gain a lot more, especially when it comes to dealing with the issues that we have, or especially around this pandemic? Wouldn't it be great to have the mental facilities to be able to make better decisions in our day-to-day lives? Another piece that I come back to often as part of this framework is curiosity and the ability to connect the dots. I really love, there's a book out there called Curious by Ian Leslie. And in this book, he pushes against the idea that random historical facts aren't useful. There's a lot of people out there that will say, what's the point of having history classes where you have to learn certain dates, for example, or when did the Revolutionary War and things like that happen? And there's some, obviously knowing a date doesn't necessarily have the same effect in your life as maybe understanding a particular, biological theory, for example. But he suggests that actually all of those little fragments or those little bits of and pieces of information actually all start to add up. And that those little bits of information will spark connections. And that those connections are what leads to new ideas and new innovations. And I've really sort of liked this concept. And I've thought to myself in the classroom, how do we take all of these sort of random facts, how do we share them with students and then use them to, in fact, create new ideas? And I think this is also the case when I'm working with clients in the fashion industry, is how do we keep employees curious? How do we get them taking all of the different facts that they have to create new ideas? I know for sure that students who really understand the history of fashion and understand why certain trends happened and when they happened and how they connect to everything from World War II to the birth of the television, and things like that, that understanding those nuances actually make a big difference when you're putting together an ad campaign, for example, or you're thinking about a new collection that you're going to drop. This is a quote from Ian Leslie, which just I think is very inspiring. Whoever you are and whatever you start, or whatever start you get in life, knowing stuff makes the world more abundant with possibilities and gleams of light more likely to illuminate darkness. It opens the universe a little, and the truly curious will be increasingly in demand. And I was going back and kind of thinking about what I wanted to say today. I kept thinking, of the crisis that we're going through right now, and just this idea of being really curious, especially about our customers and what they're going through, how that might affect the kinds of products and services that we offer to our to our customers, and how things might potentially change if we were able to do that better. The last bit of my framework, and then I'm going to jump into some ideas of how to tackle these, is leisure time. There's also there's a correlation between increased learning and leisure time. So the more space that we have in our personal lives, the more time that we'll dedicate to thinking, to fantasizing, to creating, to ideating, to even imagining sort of different worlds. And I can't help but think that many of us, in some ways, have had to slow down because we're not rushing physically from one space to another, one meeting to another. And so we've had to really think about our time a bit differently. I'm horrified by my little phone messages that I get that tell me how many hours I've been spending on my iPhone, in large part because of so many meetings that are taking place. But it's just brought to bear how much time I'm connected to my phone and how very little leisure time that I have. So remember that book that I started reading at the beginning of the pandemic, the one that I'm still haven't finished. It's called Do Nothing, and it's by an author named Celeste Headley. And this quote just really captures sort of the essence of this book, which is that we know from research that we are more creative, we're more insightful, and we're generally sharper when we allow ourselves significant amount of leisure time. And I know for all of us Americans in particular who are here, it's as much as we love to go out and play, it's hard to take a vacation, especially when we feel the stress or the pressure to perform at work. So she talks a lot about in this book this idea of lazy time, and that lazy isn't actually a bad thing, that lazy actually allows things to foment, things to really sort of trickle up or bubble up so that new ideas and possibilities are come up. And typically these things need to be non-work related. Now, to put this into context of fashion, in my 20-year career or so in fashion, the one clear thing is that the speed of the market continues to increase. In our race to become more efficient, we've also increased customer expectations, especially around deliveries of product. And in many ways, it's very non-sustainable. This is primarily due to technology, because with machine learning and artificial intelligence, we're now able to work faster than is actually humanly possible, right? So I want to say that again. Work is moving at a speed that isn't humanly possible. And yet, as humans, we're sort of expected to keep up with that pace. We actually now measure efficiency by the nanosecond when it comes to data. And for those of you who work in this space, there's just data pouring in every second, every moment that can be parsed and looked at to try to find some sort of trend that can help us in our business. And we spend a lot of time looking at that metadata. But at the same time, we primarily benchmark human productivity by the hours that we work, right? But that doesn't really measure quality. And so I think we have sort of this imbalance happening where, on the one hand, we're really expected to move at increasing speeds at the nanosecond level. And then we're sort of our quality of work is being based on an hourly perspective. Which means that some of us actually spend a little extra time at work, so to let our boss know that we care a little bit more, which might be less about working more and more about spreading our work out throughout the day to make it look like that we're busy. There's an ongoing conversation, especially in fashion, about big data and how it's been taking a lead and a role in merchandising and planning, allocation, and all those different areas. And clearly, the more that we can get into that data, the more that we can be efficient in terms of what we deliver to the market. But there's also that question of subjectivity and quality, and how do we ensure that the products that we're putting out there have a soul, have an emotion? And this is something that a lot of companies are dealing with, especially I think as we go into this crisis further and we start to think about what does this look like at the other side. Because we can't just deliver products. There's people who are suffering on the other side, our customers, right? Who need and want support from the brands, whether it's just for respite from the craziness in their lives, or if they really truly need the product or service that you offer. I mean, obviously, I don't even have to explain this screen. Each of these brands are dealing with major ramifications of COVID-19, although I would suggest that many of these companies were having hardships before, and that this certainly just sped things up. But this is also primarily because Millennial and Gen Z customers are really expecting customers to provide not only an experience, which we hear about all the time, but community. And the ultimate luxury is being able to feel connected to other people in addition to speed and access. And that's really the new luxury in the marketplace. And so brands that have spent so much time on sort of this white glove service and slow are now sort of struggling to figure out what that means, let's say, for a Neiman Marcus. If all of a sudden people want to be able to get in and get out of a store, but at the same time, they still want to have a sense of community. And what I find really interesting is that many executives in these fashion companies are typically individuals who are nearing the ends of their careers. They're the ones that are at the helm of these companies, and they have vast amount of insight, perspective, experience at their fingertips. But at the same time, at that point in their life, they're probably not engaged in day-to-day learning of new things. They're probably dealing primarily with solving issues on a day-to-day basis. And we've seen this, and I work a lot with executives, especially from my position at Parsons, of how do we help CEOs, CFOs, COOs to think differently in their busy day and try to balance out the needs of a business that's quickly changing with the needs of a shareholder, right, and revenues and building and growth. But how do you do that and also think about short-term and long-term growth and innovation so that in 3 to 5 years you don't become obsolete? So here's the exciting part. So what does this all mean? How do we sort of put this all together? How does this relate back to brand values? I think that we now more than ever, really as leaders, managers, and employees, no matter what level you're working at, we need to be working towards that maximum taste. We need to help solve the issues that we face today. And whether it's dealing with COVID-19 or just really thinking about more sustainable supply chains, engaging Gen Z, thinking about different niche markets like LGBT, how do we do that authentically? And if so much of our adult time is spent at the office and working, what is a company's role then in providing employees a continuing education? What is the company's role in ensuring that there's opportunities to be curious and to connect those dots without the risk of losing your job? And what about leisure time, right? Do companies have more that they can do to ensure that people actually have space to do things outside of work that will potentially bring back more ideas and more innovation? So the other little buzzword that we hear a lot too in fashion is authenticity, because this is something that millennial and Gen Z companies really demand. They want to know that brand values, right, are in line or in alignment with their values, the customer values. And one of the things is we hear a lot of companies that talk about these values, especially through marketing, but when it comes down to it, they're not really living those values internally. And I think some of those have come to bear throughout this COVID-19 crisis. The one that comes to mind is Amazon, that talks a lot about efficiencies in production and how they treat their employees. And yet, on the other hand, there's a lot of employees that we're starting to see some pretty horrific stories coming out about health and safety issues related to this pandemic. So in my two roles, I, as Raul said, I'm an assistant professor at Parsons. My day-to-day work is primarily in the graduate space, where I work with students who are coming back to learn or to have the space to luxuriate in ideas and think differently. Most of our students are really coming back to school because they just feel like they're part of a machine, and they want to be able to step off for a little bit and have a space to think. And they want a place to have conversation. They want to have a place to take risks, and they want a place to be able to challenge conventions. And so the ideas that really permeate from our classrooms are quite electric and really keep me going in an industry that I think can get you down pretty quickly. But our thoughts as professors are, how do we make sure that these graduates can leave Parsons and go back into their careers more successful and really make a difference and initiate the change that they came to Parsons to engage in. Also, in my role at Fashion Concert, I started this company about 10 years ago, and it was really a traditional consulting agency. And over the past few years, I've noticed more and more in my consulting activities that I would get hired to do projects, and I would bring to bear whatever it took, right? I would do an audit, I would create a project, or to meet the demands of the whatever the issue was that I was hired to come in and discuss or to solve. And then typically I would go away, and then it was up to the company to kind of figure that out. And so often I watched as sort of the big ideas that I brought to the table or the project that I created would sort of fall apart. And I always ask myself, well, is it me? Am I just are the ideas wrong, or what's going on? And I've realized over the last years is that any consultant can come in and put a project together and make change. But if the people inside the company don't understand why that change has been made or why that project was done in a certain way, it's going to crumble because there is no sort of intellectual support for it. There's no true sort of understanding. So I pivoted the agency a few years ago to really start thinking about how do we go in and work with companies and educate them on current ways of thinking, on new innovations that we could actually teach employees, teach leaders, so then we could empower them to make their own decisions internally. And we could help to guide them in certain directions or to challenge them in certain areas, but ultimately leave it up to them to find the solutions that work best for them. And I think this is particularly important in the fashion industry because I think we have a tendency to pick things that really work and just scale them as big as possible. And then we wonder 2 or 3 years later why it's not working anymore because the market has sort of moved on to the next big idea. Sometimes it's even faster than that. And so, one of the things that I'm noticing in working with clients today is that now, instead of sort of solving a problem now, we're looking at the bigger picture and we're actually, like I said, empowering employees to make decisions as they move forward and that they can be more agile, and more um, empowered again to make decisions long after I'm gone. So today I wanted to make some recommendations around this framework and thinking about how education, curiosity, and leisure time actually can serve as a way to ground a company in their values and really actively in their values, not just saying it, not as a marketing thing, but really meaning it and facilitating that. So before I jump in, I'm going to perhaps bore you for a couple seconds on this idea of learning modality. And I think it's important just to understand this. I know when I started teaching, this was very useful. There are four kinds of learners. There's visual learners who see. There's auditory learners who typically hear well, and that's how they take in information. There's other people who are more tactile. They have to touch things. And then there's people who need to move, right? And typically, each of us sort of have one area that we are better in or that serves us best. But oftentimes, it's a conglomeration of one or two or three things that we need. What we do know as teachers is that you can't just do one, not only because you're not going to reach all the students in the room, but because it gets boring and it becomes stale and the same information just keeps getting pushed out in the same sort of modality. The thing that I think of is email. As we now use email to do basically everything, and I think if we're all being a bit honest, it's hard to read a full email, especially a long email in today's world. We are just too stretched for time, and reading can be very difficult for a lot of us if we're busy, and for some people, reading is difficult in general. We need to see it, we need to touch it. So I want you to keep these things in mind as I give some of my tips. So let's start first with education and talk about some of the ways that companies can think about, or organizations can think about education. And I'll give some examples, of course, of how this relates with virtual and digital ways. So I have just a couple of examples. The first one is encourage employees to take classes. I think this is pretty obvious. But I've always found it surprising how this is talked about, but rarely done. And I really truly believe that companies that genuinely support their employees taking courses, whether it's at Parsons, FIT, or online, so many great courses online now, that this can continue to keep employees engaged and learning and bringing new ideas. That means also that companies need to allow for company time for this to happen, because if it's part of your values to be innovative, then that is part of company time to facilitate that. You also, as a company, need to think about how to allow employees to come back with the information they've learned and to reinsert it back into the company culture. So those are so that everyone gets to benefit from the learning that's being done. Second, develop consistent education opportunities in-house. I think a lot of companies do this quite well, in that they'll have seminars or they'll have retreats or things like that. But what I want to focus on here is making sure that those are consistent and that employees know that they can be part of them and that other meetings aren't scheduled over these learning times, and that there's opportunities to learn that aren't necessarily connected to business outcomes. This is really an area that I'm working with my agency to develop education opportunities within businesses, whether it's virtual or digital, right, or in the physical space. And sometimes it's not just, hey, how do we come in and teach you how to do X, Y, Z? It's bringing in a panel of experts that are talking about, let's say, diversity and inclusion and how to think about that differently as a company. The other thing that a lot of companies are now doing, especially larger companies that have the ability to do this, are to bring in online learning directly into the company. And what that allows is to be a little bit more specific to the needs of the company, so that, let's say, a beginning merchandiser might have access to some advanced classes in retail math or algorithms and thinking like that. One of the great things about online learning is you can also do online quizzes and diagnostics, and that can lead to companies providing their own certification. Certification can be a great way to identify people who are taking the time to learn, and it can be used as a way to promote and to engage and collaborate. One-on-one mentorship, I think this is really important. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I just want, one of the things that comes to mind here is allowing for what I call internal internships. What does that mean? Giving people in your company access to shadow people higher up in the ranks, for example, or to shadow people who are in different departments. It is so important to keep that learning ladder going within a corporation or organization, and there's so much learning that can be done just in that simple approach. And I believe that this really should be part of the offer of any new employees, is that we are here to support you to learn, and that you get to be part or an apprentice to people here at the office. And that also means that we need to teach people internally better how to be teachers. Online learning conferences, things like that are obviously, we're doing a lot of those right now in COVID-19. And I think we're finally realizing that online especially is a cheaper, easier way to engage people at all levels of the company, no matter their geography. And the last thing I want to mention here is there's a real opportunity right now for companies to think about how to create learning modules that relate to their services and products. One that comes to mind, for example, is Clo 3D, which is one of the top level sort of 3D design agencies. Parsons is looking right now to bring that very much into their programs. And so let's say if Clo 3D certainly has training programs, but do they have training programs that make sense for colleges? This is a great opportunity, because if Clo can get into Parsons and that becomes part of our education, that means as they graduate, these students are ready and wanting to use this product. So that allows the company to potentially grow. Curiosity. So curiosity, a couple things that come to mind here are encouraging offsite visits during company time and allowing for connecting time that doesn't have to do with day-to-day work. And this could be as simple as making sure that at certain hours of the day, the expectation is that people are out doing things and not stuck at the office. I always sort of hated the idea of Google work environments, not because they're super cool, but because part of where I get most of my inspiration is when I leave the office and take a walk through Chelsea or wherever I am. And sometimes I even have my headphones in and I'm just paying attention to the world around me, and there's ideas that come. And so even just challenging companies to have employees actually leave the office for lunch could be a way to develop opportunities for curiosity. Um, Also, facilitating engagement outside of the company's focus. So, what does that mean, right? What sort of ancillary things help? Is it a book club, for example? Is it a film club? Is it offering language courses and things like that? Second language courses? Is it providing? I know Liberty in London was offering some knitting. They offer knitting classes, and then that's become. There was a great article in the Independent about how it's becoming a dating hotspot for people in their 50s. But just kind of thinking about what are the ancillary things that people could do that kind of brings in a new energy into the office. And the last one I'll mention here is sabbaticals, which is a very academic idea. But what about companies allowing people to leave for 1 to 3 months to go out and sort of engage in the world, to learn a new skill, a new trade, to go travel, whatever that might be. So these are all things that I think of when I think of curiosity. Lastly, leisure time. I think this is pretty obvious, but as Americans, as I said earlier, we have a hard time sort of allowing for leisure time, whereas other countries really take this very seriously. For most people, taking the month of August is really important and a time to have some downtime. But it's really important for companies to think about cutoff times for emails, cutoff times for text, so that employees don't feel stressed about having to respond. Something as simple as that. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about, and I'm getting a lot of questions from businesses, is should we go to a fully online workflow? What does a hybrid look like? Do we need people to come back to the office? I think it's really important for companies to start thinking about that now and putting strategy in place to ensure that it's very clear. Because I don't know about all of you, but sometimes I feel like even though I could easily go into a Zoom and provide all of the expertise that I can in that meeting, that if I'm not there in person, that there's a sense of discrimination against that I'm not sort of showing up in the full way. And so companies are going to have to think a little bit differently about that. Companies need to insist on vacations, and they also need to think about focusing less on time work and more on quality of output. I love, again, this quote from Celeste Headley that, in fact, sometimes leaning in or pushing, it doesn't lead to a good output. It actually just makes us more stressed out. And there's a lot of data, a lot of research out there that suggests that we can do more if we have some space to do that. Another little interesting piece of data suggests that we typically, as employees, finish whatever we have to in the time we're given. So if we have 2 hours to complete a project, we'll get it done. If we have 4 hours for the same exact project, we'll take 4 hours to get that project done. We'll go chat with some people in between. We'll maybe shop on Amazon for a few minutes or whatever it might be. But we definitely sort of fill the container that we're given. And so companies could potentially think differently about that. So what about those modalities I mentioned? One of the great things about virtual and digital is that it allows us to actually use some of those modalities in different ways. So I mentioned email before. What if instead of an email, you have a company video that comes out that is easy to watch? What if it's a podcast, which I'll mention a little bit here in a second? And then thinking, again, like how each of your employees might be a little bit different in how they take in information. So maybe it's both a letter, an email, and a video, or maybe it's a podcast and there's a transcript, so that there's different ways for people to engage with that information. So I mentioned podcasts. This is an area that Fashion Consort has been very involved in the last year. What we're learning is that this is a technology. It's a lo-fi technology, but because it is lo-fi, it's really a great way to share information. It's a great way to communicate company values. It's a great way to provide opportunities for education as well. You can listen in your headphones. It's very intimate. And typically you can be doing more than one thing. So you could be commuting, house cleaning, working out. And so then you're using two different modalities. You're being kinesthetic while you work out, and you're being oral and you're listening to information. And so we've been working with a lot of companies to think about how we can use this sort of lo-fi technology as an approach to help educate employees and build brand values. Some of the examples, I won't tell you obviously the brand names, but we've been talking about or building a weekly hosted company news, so that on a weekly basis, there's a hosted conversation about the news that's exciting and important to disseminate to individuals in the company. We are working on an idea around an internal employee feature and spotlight podcast where we allow people in our in organizations to share their expertise. So often I sit in meetings, especially at Parsons, where I'll sit with somebody and realize like the wealth of information they have, and I didn't even know that that's what they did until they mentioned it. So a podcast could be a way to kind of feature a lot of different types of expertise in an organization. And additionally, obviously, the one that we think of most is external podcasts. A lot of millennials, you see the graph here, are especially millennials and Gen Z. There's an uptick in listening to podcasts, in large part because you can listen to them while you're doing other things. But they also are a way to encourage the alignment of brand values. So in fashion, especially, let's take streetwear, for example. It's not just about the sweatpants or the hat or the Supreme logo. It's about a sense of connection and community, like I mentioned earlier. And there's conversations that happen all around, that concept of that uh, piece of clothing that are so much bigger than the piece of clothing themselves. So having a podcast that kind of delves into that and shares information and inspiration around that, or even how things are made, so transparency being another buzzword, becomes a really great way to engage customers. I love this quote. This is something that I picked up from a webinar during COVID-19 um, early on, which comes from Lakshmi. She says, "We're good at meeting, but not connecting. Meetings are draining, and connecting is energizing." And I think this is so important, right? We spend so much time having meetings, but so very little time actually connecting ideas, connecting people. And there's so much energy to be had if we can figure all of that out. So it's a very scary time, I think, for the fashion industry. There's a lot of unknowns, and I think there is a real opportunity for businesses to reset and to think about the kinds of businesses they want to have in the future. And that future is going to happen very soon. Um, and that's very much around brand values, again, that align both internally with your employees and your customers. For employees, I think this is also a moment of reckoning because they have to decide now how they want to spend their time, and to what ends, right? And now that life has become all that more precious, and we realize like this kind of thing can just take over and change everything at a moment's notice, that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about things and being more expansive, whether it is taking a webinar or participating in a live stream like this, or joining a MOOC. I think this has been at least a moment in time where we're realizing there's opportunity to do more. I just want to share with you, and then I'll open up for questions, two projects that we're doing with Fashion Consort. The first one is Retail Revolution, and this was actually developed for Parsons as part of a class. Would welcome and recommend that all of you come and follow us on Instagram at Retail Revolution Podcast, or you can visit our website. This was our opportunity to have conversations with experts in the field of fashion retailing, not only to provide insight and expertise, but also to talk about COVID-19 and how it was affecting their businesses. Everything from Senior Vice President at Intermix, Ron Thurston, who joined us as one of our first guests, to the CEO of Beyond XR, who's in digital showrooms and digital space, who's seen a major uptick in business, to John Harari, who is the CEO of WindowsWear. And I was just telling John before this that he's now in the top 3 most listened episodes in the last week, and so we really appreciated him. And additionally, we're doing a Fashion Consort News Bites. These are short form episodes, typically 3 to 4 minutes, that share some ideas around some of these things that I've shared with you today. Current news, sort of current thinking, that we hope is helpful to those of you who are trying to make decisions that affect your overall businesses. So I would welcome you to come visit us at fashionconsort.com, or to follow us at Fashion Consort Agency to get more information. And that is my contact information. And I will open up to questions. I think, Raul, you're going to be our moderator.
I would love to. Yes. George, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
much information in so short time. I'm been monitoring the Instagram because we're live. I'll check if people have questions, and I would love to open it here in Zoom to see if anybody has a question. You guys can unmute yourself. If you're too shy, you can text it. You can type the question, and I'll read it out loud. So,
yeah, as we're waiting for questions to come in, I will say if you are interested in either podcast, they're both on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn. So basically everywhere you can get it, you'll find those podcasts there.
This is your opportunity. I was always so scared to ask questions when I was a student. So, and now I have Josh, such a great teacher here. So I want to let myself go. Let's see if people have questions here. Does anybody have a question? Okay. One sec.
Raul, while you're looking, funny that you should say that. We're finding with online education that the student who typically sits in the back or is always in the corner, yeah, they don't get to do that online.
Yeah, they have to be up front.
Yeah, so we've really had some great.
Have you found this new way of working, or at least for the past month, that is more exhausting for you as a teacher?
Yes, I think in large parts. So I was actually tasked last year to build a brand new program for Parsons that was online. So I've had the benefit of really thinking what a ground up online learning program would look like. And I come from, by the way, from sort of the e-commerce. That was sort of where I spent most of my time, was in creative direction around e-com and digital content. And so I really think of omni-channel retail the same as I do omni-channel learning. But one of the things that I think that we're all struggling with right now is that we sort of were forced to transition really quickly, and that sort of upset all of our workflows and schedules. And so, at least from my perspective, I've spent a lot of time not only doing my own work, but also helping my colleagues to kind of get up to the level that they need to be able to teach online. And I think it's pretty usual for me to have 4 or 5 meetings a day, and it's very tiring.
Okay. Pilar Escolano is asking. Well, she's saying, thank you for sharing. How do you think fashion education will change from now?
Well, fashion education is going through a major shift right now because, as I said earlier, fashion was always more of a skill, and it was always typically learned on the job. So it was not unusual until the mid-90s to go get an associate's degree just to have some sort of basic level of college education, and then jump right into a merchandising job, for example, because everything else the employer would teach you, and every sort of company had their own way of doing things. I think the more and more that fashions become part of corporate culture, and the more and more that there's public shareholders and things like that, and the more and more that revenues are driving decisions, the more and more fashion education has had to shift from something that's very niche to something that looks at more of a traditional MBA, but then also understands the nuances of fashion. So from our perspective at Parsons, we're very much engaged in this idea, less about skill teaching, because we think that happens on the job, and much more about how to think differently, how to connect the dots, like I was talking earlier. A lot of our students are coming as economists, as biologists, as heads of hotel chain, things like that you would never think would come into fashion, but they understand that there's a new connection between hospitality, fashion, even church.
Yeah.
Just in terms of how do you build a community or a local community. So we're racing to kind of figure out what those things are and be at the forefront of essentially trying to open up those conversations for new leaders.
Okay. Jackson Guillermo on Instagram is asking, do you believe the source of materials and where the clothes are made must be addressed on the post/ads as a conversation, or must be available but not always mentioned?
Well, I think we're moving towards the direction, especially now that safety is such a concern and health. After all, the clothes we put on us, that it's on our biggest organ, skin, and so there is a direct correlation to our health and to the clothes that we wear. I think a lot of customers were not aware of that. I think, but if anything, we're seeing a lot of the same things that were happening in food and health happening in fashion. Do I think it's required? I don't. I think we're moving in that direction, and I think that there's a lot of value in that. I think what people don't realize is how complex the fashion industry is. And so the question becomes, what exactly is the information that people need that actually helps? And how do we do it in a way that's ethical? Even in the food industry, sometimes I feel like, what does organic even
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
So I don't, I might buy it for the marketing purposes, but I'm not wholly sure.
Hmm.
I happen to be vegan, so I spend a lot of time looking at labels.
I see.
But yeah, I think we're moving in that direction, but I don't know that we have a sense as an industry yet or an agreement on what it is we should be transparent about.
Okay. Pilar is saying, I teach in the luxury fashion master at ESIC in Madrid, and students came from anywhere but fashion.
Hmm. That's interesting. I've taught many classes at ESUM in Madrid, and we're finding the same thing. A lot of people are coming into the fashion space because they see a lot of potential. And I would agree with that. I think there's a real opportunity to think differently in fashion. And as a professor, I love seeing people coming from different areas and bringing with them their own experiences and expertise.
Perfect. Does anybody else have a question before we wrap this up? Please type it in.
Hey, Josh, it's John Hurry. I've got two questions for you.
Great, John.
Number one, you'd mentioned the speed of technology and being measured in nanoseconds, and the sort of human beings are measured in hours. How do
Yeah.
you how do you reconcile that for the future? Because obviously, as you mentioned, it's just unsustainable. That's my first question, and then my second question, in regards to all the things that you had mentioned, building brand values virtually. Who do you think does it best, or what's your biggest takeaway? Is there a certain country or company that you really think is a template for others to follow?
Great questions. Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Nanoseconds versus hours. I mean, this really is the big question, because the more and more efficient we become, and the more and more as an industry we focus on technologies to help make decisions, the more and more there's going to be a chasm, or an imbalance between what we as human beings bring to the table versus what the data is saying. And I'll give you a quick example. Um, the data at this point can pretty much tell us exactly what should be in any given collection at any given time. I mean, we can get down to that granular of information and know exactly when it should be delivered to store. We can have a pretty good sense of when it should hit the floor. We have a pretty good sense of when the email blast should go out to support the collection. I mean, all of that in a perfect world can give us exactly the information we need. But then the question is, but what about if the algorithm is sort of building on what is already happening? What about the outliers? What about the new ideas? What about the trend that just sort of pops up randomly for no apparent reason? Fashion, in many ways, was always very good at that, because fashion, especially, was very different by culture, very different by geography. And so all of these things sort of mixed and matched. I think one of the things that we're going to have to watch, especially as we go more into data, is sort of the mono culture that comes out of algorithmic or data driven fashion. um, Certainly brands like Fashion Nova or even Zara, are benefiting from this. But on the flip side, I think a lot of luxury companies are realizing um, that perhaps the going in the opposite direction to a more hands-on, less data-driven, might not lead to the same kind of revenue, but might actually lead to more engagement and loyalty with their customer. And so in the long term, it might be a benefit. So I think these are questions that that executives at all levels are having and trying to figure out. Ultimately, I think that companies have to find a balance that works best for them. There is no one size fits all for any company, and every time I work with different CEOs or executives, that's the first thing I say is, we're not trying to be Zara, we're not trying to be LVMH. We need to be you. If you're not you and you don't understand your customer and you don't know how to communicate, whether that's digitally or in analog, you're not going to be around for very long. In terms of a company that's doing well, I have to say, Airbnb just keeps popping up on my radar. I don't know how many of you read the letter from Brian Chesky when he had to lay off a lot of his workforce. But it really caught my attention as being extraordinarily human. And I think that one of the things that has made Airbnb successful, and I realize this is not fashion, it's hospitality, is it's connection to people, and the fact that they're relying on people out there to share their homes and their intimate personal space. And I can't help but think that there's a lot to be gained in the fashion industry by looking at Airbnb as a model. And obviously, Airbnb is very good at algorithms and figuring out how to provide the best options to customers. And obviously, they're also going through a lot of they're going through a major crisis now. But I think I was just talking to somebody, actually a colleague of mine, who used the term that Airbnb appreciated pirates, meaning that they wanted their employees to go rogue and try things out and then come back and tell them if it worked or not, and that they wouldn't be at the risk of losing their job if they tried something crazy. I don't know about you, but in the fashion industry, the margins are so thin that being told to just go try something
Yeah.
and good luck is very unusual, but I think there's something to be gained from that.
Thank you, George.
I've heard Patagonia has also like an amazing employee culture. Like they have so many perks and so many the way that they do things is just not corporate at all. I mean, it's still a corporate thing, they have to run a business, but I feel like they have unlimited vacations and days off and like sick days and work from home and maternity leave and all these things that always people that have corporate jobs are like so like fighting for almost in any other company.
That's a great example of a company that's true to their values.
Yeah.
They are, after all, an outdoor company that's
Yeah.
dedicated to nature. And if all their employees are stuck inside all day, then they're literally not working within their core value of
nature.
Yeah.
Perfect. I think this is it, John.
Sounds great.
Yep.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Just a reminder that this video, it will be available on WindowsWear in a couple of hours, maybe tomorrow, and you can find it there. And next week, we'll have a WindowsWear live with Jolene Mojica, or head of trends and tours, and it's about back to basics. It's a conversation about a trend report. It's back to basics and how primary colors is such a big trend in fashion right now and kind of like all the time. So we'll see you guys there on Tuesday, and thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you. I hope to hear from a lot of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.